Hello and welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Rahim Rahimtullah. We're at the DCAF conference on security sector governance in Ukraine. Joining me now is one of the guest speakers at the conference and a senior fellow at the DCAF, Mr. Simon Lunn. Mr. Lunn, many thanks for joining us.
Welcome.
In the last couple of years since the invasion by Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces have come under much greater scrutiny than ever before. Many say that great strides have been made in reforming the armed forces in this time. Is that a position that you agree with?
Well, I think you'd have to look at reform in two ways. There's the structures, the Ministry of Defence and the defence set up in general here, on the one hand, and whether that is being reformed satisfactorily, and then there's the combat capabilities of the forces themselves, and the latter is very difficult for me to assess. I would say en passant that the forces here have deployed with the NATO forces in various missions, and I think I've heard nothing but positive comments on their capabilities. So that's, I think, a positive sign. On the general reform of the Ministry of Defence and what needs to be done to make sure you have an effective security sector, I think a lot more needs to be done. The reform process, I think, is underway, but it's slow.
You're talking here so more of the administrative and oversight
yes, administration of the armed forces, the running of the armed forces themselves, their relationship with the Parliament, and the Parliament should have an effective role in doing what parliaments in most places do, which is to monitor and oversee their armed forces to make sure the executive branch are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they're spending the money in the right way, they're spending it in an effective and an efficient way, and that the armed forces in general are reflecting the values of the society that they're protecting. That is an overall reform structure that really needs to take place in order for Ukraine to satisfy its own ambitions of moving closer to the Western community. So there are two sets of changes going on here. One is the overall structure, and the second is the capabilities of the armed forces themselves. And of course, the second is both of those processes actually are difficult to undertake simply because of the conflict that you've got undergoing, and makes the whole process of change much more difficult than it normally would be.
In the sense that they've got to not just train their army on the one hand, but also actively put it into practice at the same time, and these two things are somewhat mutually exclusive.
Well, it's like learning to fly an aircraft and flying it at the same time, because yes, you're absolutely right that the very things you want the armed forces to achieve, they're having to put into practice, or they've had to put into practice up to now. It just makes things more complicated. It also makes people sometimes much more reluctant to undertake these changes, simply because they have direct impact as to what goes on. The war, I sense, however, has had a reverse implication, which is that it has unlocked a certain amount of enthusiasm and energy for change, which I think I've noticed since my last visit here, which was several months ago. This is, I think, quite remarkable, the unleashing of what I would term civic determination to undertake reform, because people who've served in the volunteer battalions or elsewhere have seen how this works in practice, and when they're not happy, then obviously they're determined to make things change. And of course, as in any country that comes from the background that Ukraine comes from, you have an inbuilt problem, an inbuilt bureaucracy. You have people used to do things in the old way. You have a mentality sometimes of reluctance to change, reluctance to outside interference. All of that makes this process much more difficult. But what is welcome is the signs of determination that one can see here during this conference and elsewhere, of people who have seen things from the other side and are determined to make the reform process count, and it has to count if Ukraine is to move along.
It's absolutely, I mean, it's a crucial moment, isn't it, now for them to seize this opportunity. Do you feel then that ultimately it does need and will come from the grassroots as opposed to from on high?
I think it has to come. Well, you hope the two things will happen at the same time.
Because I think it's quite an unusual process, is not the formation of an armed forces, of a military, so strongly from the civil side, because we're so used to seeing it come from the state. I mean, the state looks after the armed forces, it makes defense policy, whereas here in Ukraine, what we've had, in tandem with, of course, the Maidan Revolution, which was a huge civil society uprising, that has now spilled over into defense and the armed forces. I mean, what kind of challenges, what kind of opportunities does this present?
Well, unusual circumstances produce unusual solutions, and here is quite a unique situation in the way that you've just described. I think one would say that at the one hand, obviously, from the grassroots determination, the volunteerism is a very positive thing because it injects a certain amount of determination into the process. The one caveat would be that whatever the shape or form those armed forces take, whether they're territorial or they're professional, they need to be under democratic control. They need to be under the subordination and accountable to democratically elected authorities. The danger always would be that local forces, local militias are not under that control, and that I think would be a very, very negative signal for Ukraine to be sending.
I mean, we already, actually, this is the challenge that we do face today, is it not? We have several volunteer battalions who've been working in the East, the Azov Battalion, for example. They have not always, shall we say, done themselves proud in the headlines, and they've come in for criticism, as has the Ukrainian Defense Ministry for not being able to bring them into the fold.
Well, this is a process. It's not easy. It takes time. It takes perseverance. And again, one has to try to, whenever you're, as we have done very often in the past, help countries through these transitional processes, you have to understand that context matters. Context does mean that some of the things, some of the best practices that we would like to recommend have to be seen under the constraints of local conditions. And that does mean that sometimes people are very reluctant to do the sorts of things that you would assume best practices would suggest. But eventually, one would hope that the process will work its way through, and that the people concerned will see that if they want a future for the country in the direction that they would seek, then that process needs to take its course, and they have to satisfy, if you like, the conditions of other democratic societies where the armed forces play a very particular role and are subordinate to and accountable to their elected leadership.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time. So perhaps just as a final thought then, I think following on from that, it seems to me like the armed forces reform is just one side of the major reforms which need to happen in Ukraine. I think it's about changing the mentality of the people. Do you ultimately see here that this is a huge opportunity for Ukraine?
It's an opportunity, and it's very doable. It has happened in other countries. We've seen transitional societies, countries that belong to the former Soviet Union, where similar processes have had to take place, where similar changes have had to take place, where generations have had to be replaced for that process finally to solidify. It's entirely doable. It requires the willpower and the awareness of the people who are doing it.
And it's about building institutions, because it's the institutions that we build, and those will stay after the people are gone.
It's building democratic, solid institutions, and that's built by people with the right attitudes and the right approach. So the two things have to go together.
All right, well, that's where we'll have to leave our discussion today, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining us here.
You're welcome.
You've been watching Ukraine Today. I've been joined by a senior fellow at the DCAF, Mr. Simon Lunn. Unfortunately, that's where we'll have to leave it today because we are out of time, but many thanks for watching, and do join us again.